Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Chapter 1's discussion today. I'm going to go over the material from Chapter 1 of our textbook in this video. So this textbook describes the human brain, and this chapter introduces our study of the human brain and its relation to our behavior. And it goes through these 5 sections, which we'll cover today. A lot of this is kind of review about genetics and about evolution from many of your other classes, but for many of you, this will be a refresher that is going to be helpful as we move through the rest of the course. So every year between 2 and 7 million people in the US, for example, suffer from a traumatic brain injury, a large proportion of them due to traffic accidents. So this is involving a wound to the brain from a blow or a concussion. And scientists who live with a traumatic brain injury, Lynch, forecasts that just like him, these people will live their lives without a diagnosis, without a plan, without any rehabilitation, and without much hope for recovery. And I wonder if any of you have anyone in your lives that have been influenced or affected by traumatic brain injury as well. My dad's sister, my Aunt Wendy, when I was only 2 or 3, suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car accident and continues to suffer from the consequences to this day. And that's been one of the reasons that I've become interested in the study of the human brain. So why should we study the brain and behavior? We talked a little bit about this in the introductory video. The brain produces behavior and human consciousness, and how it does so is one of the last remaining scientific questions that you can choose to answer. And so this alone draws many people into the field. Also, the brain is one of the most complex things in the universe, and it's the most complex organ on Earth. And so this complexity is something that might interest some scientists or researchers. And then we're all, our lives are all affected by this growing list of behavioral disorders that we now understand are caused by abnormalities or damage or disease in the brain. And the more we can understand how the brain works, the better we can treat these afflictions. As you know, the brain is divided actually into 2 systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system, and they're composed of neurons. And out of there radiate all these processes and cells, which are called the peripheral nervous system, which control our skin, muscles, and organs. So as I mentioned, the nervous system is composed of cells, just like the rest of our body. And in this case, the cells are called neurons, which we'll revisit again in a couple of weeks. And these neurons communicate with one another, and they also communicate with the skin, the muscles, and the organs. Try to move around so I'm not hiding some of the text. Here's a picture of our human brain. It's about the size of your 2 fists put together in your head. And in the outer area is called the cerebrum. This folded area on the outside is divided into 2 hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. And then on the inner area here, on this inside area, is something called the brainstem, which connects to the spinal cord and the cerebrum and brings information to and from our brain. Also, you can see the cerebellum, another section of the brain, which we'll talk about. And this is tucked under the cerebrum there and is involved in coordination of our movements. Okay, so the forebrain, this cerebrum area, is most prominent in mammals and birds, and it's responsible for the conscious behaviors that we attribute to being human. The brainstem, on the other hand, is the source of behaviors that we share in common with animals like reptiles and birds, like breathing and eating and sleeping. So the brain, one of the interesting things about the brain is it seems to produce this subjective inner experience of consciousness. It feels like something to have a brain and to go about the world with a body and a brain. And it's been shown, for instance, that one can be conscious even without the body having to move around. So there's some patients that get a traumatic brain injury and they develop a syndrome called locked-in syndrome, where they're awake, but they can't move any of their muscles of their body, and they still report ongoing conscious experience during that time. So the brain by itself, all alone, without the body attached to it, seems to still be able to produce this inner subjective experience, which is another very interesting aspect of brain and behavior that many people choose to study with their career. Another indication that the brain and the mind are inextricably linked is a new treatment option that's available called deep brain stimulation, in which you can implant electrodes deep into the brain in an area like the thalamus or a part of the brainstem, and you can stimulate with small amounts of electric current and treat some common disorders like Parkinson's and traumatic brain injury and depression with these minor changes in the electrical activity of the neurons there. So just altering the physical structure of the brain can influence this subjective inner experience that we have. To consider the link between the brain and behavior, we also have to think about what behavior itself is. So behavior's been defined as a consistent, as a pattern in time. So any type of thing that you do that unfolds over time, whether it be moving or even thinking. And most of the behaviors that animals in our world exhibit are some mix of inherited and learned behaviors. So many of the behaviors that we have are inherited. For instance, this bird has a particular beak shape that allows it, that it inherits. It doesn't need to learn anything, that allows it to eat these pine cones very easily. And it doesn't need to learn. So a bird born all by itself can still do this. Whereas these roof rats need to learn from their mother how to eat these same pine cones. So they still have the physical ability to do so, but their neural circuits don't come pre-programmed to do this. Instead, they have a cultural transmission of information from the mother to the infant about how to do these things. So most human behaviors retain a mix of the inherited and the learned behavior. So we do have some inherited behaviors that we can do right when we come out of our parents, and such as the newborn sucking response. But later in life, our behaviors come more and more to be influenced by learning and the culture that we're in. So depending on where you grew up, you might eating at the table in different ways, using different types of utensils, and have different customs. So we'll think now a little bit about the history of the study between the link between brain and behavior, which goes back as far as the ancient Greeks, who believed that our behavior is a function of some completely non-material, kind of ghostly mind. They thought, Aristotle specifically believed that the brain had no role but to cool the blood, and that it had no role in the production of behavior. And so it was the psyche, or the mind, as it was called, that was believed to be the source of all of human behaviors, and nothing physical in our body. So things like imagination or opinion, desire, pleasure, pain, memory, and reason were all thought to be things that some non-material entity was in control of. And along with this belief came the corollary that this consciousness, this non-material consciousness, would survive beyond our death. If it didn't require our physical body to be there, then of course it would still be present after our physical body was no longer here. So this has led to the position of mentalism, this idea that our behavior is completely governed by this non-material entity called the mind. In the 1700s, I believe, the opinions evolved into an idea called dualism, that we have a non-material mind, just like in mentalism, but that there's a material body that contributes to our behavior, and it's the interplay between this non-material mind and the material body that leads to our effective behavior in the world, which led to a problem we can think of as the mind-body problem, or how this non-material and material entities interact. You may have taken courses in philosophy and learned about this. Rene Descartes proposed that this non-material mind can direct our behavior through exerting influence through our brain and then on through our muscles. So the idea that the non-material mind can direct our behavior, but that the body and the brain are the intermediary between those. Descartes believed that this area of communication between the non-material and the material mind was in this pineal gland, this non-symmetrical gland in the center of the brainstem. And he believed that it would direct the flow of fluid down through the body to move our muscles around like puppets, similar to how many machines were working at the time. And since this time, it's been now understood that the pineal gland seems to be more involved in our biological rhythms than our intelligence or our behavioral control of our bodies. It's known now that the fluid isn't pumped from the ventricles to control movement. And also we understand that we don't, in our worldview, there's no room for a non-material entity like a mind that doesn't touch any physical thing to exert influence on it. It would violate the laws of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of matter and conservation of energy. That energy by which it influenced the body would have to come from somewhere. Which leads us to the third point of view, which our field uses as an assumption moving forward, is that of materialism, that our behavior can be completely explained by the function of the nervous system without any recourse of the mind. We don't need to think about a non-material entity that isn't physically here. And this idea kind of grew out of theories of Wallace and Darwin and of Mendel, of evolution, and of the human's role in the animal kingdom, as we'll see. As you've learned by now, the evolution by natural selection explains how new species evolve, and existing species like us change over time. And it involves differential success in reproduction. And through this reproduction, characteristics that led to that success are passed on to future generations, which subsequently increases their chances of success in the same environment, leading to increase in that gene in the gene pool and a gradual change in the genetics of the species. Notice how this is about the interaction of organisms with their environment, because as the environment changes, different organisms' phenotypes or expression of their genes are more or less affected. So if you have similar genes, you're likely to express similar traits. And therefore, your ability to survive is related to your the genes that you inherited from your parents and that you pass on to your offspring. How this relates to our study of the brain is that because all animal species are related in this way, their brains must all be related as well. And so because we're all related, our behaviors must be related as well. When we study an animal eating, we can learn about our own eating behavior. And because our complex behavior evolved from simpler animals' brain and behavior, we can study those simple brains and behaviors to understand our own. And we can understand that nonetheless, even though their behaviors are more simple, they still depend on the same learning principles as ours do. So we can learn a lot from their study. So to bring this kind of materialism into perspective, our modern psychology and biological psychology takes for granted that behavior and neural function are the same thing. Our behavior is completely caused by functioning of our nervous system. Hebb, a Canadian famous neuroscientist, is quoted as saying, "There's no separate soul or life force to stick a finger into the brain now and then and make neural cells do what they would not otherwise do." So there's nothing except the brain. And this subjective feeling of what it's like to be us is also completely explained by physical processes inside our body. And this doesn't necessarily clash with religious beliefs. You can be thought of as more orthogonal ways of understanding the world. Science isn't a set of belief systems that are dictated, but it's a strategy by which investigators can come to answer questions independently of one another. So eliminative materialism indicates that if we can describe it without thinking of a mind, why not just use the physical explanation alone? So we can just use a physical explanation to understand what consciousness is, or what pain is, or what attention is, even though in our day-to-day conversation, we're talking about these as very mental phenomena. So our contemporary theories of the brain are all materialistic. We should be able to objectively, physically measure every aspect of our consciousness with our equipment. And any given thing you think or do should have corresponding brain activity. Let's think about where the human brain evolved from and where our own bodies and species evolved from. You've all learned by now the taxonomic classification of our animal kingdom. And it's only Animalia that we share with all other animals that contains species of muscles and nervous systems like us, unlike fungi and plants and bacteria. So muscles and nervous systems are coexistent species, and they evolve together to control our movement. The function of a nervous system is to take in the outgoing world and to produce the appropriate movement with the muscles. Okay, so we have these 5 kingdoms: bacteria, single cells, plants, fungi, and animalia. And it's only in the animalia that these brain cells and nervous systems have evolved to allow us to move about the world, sense, and interact. As the nervous system has evolved, it's transformed. So first, the brain cells and muscles formed kind of nerve nets, like in jellyfish. So there's no center, there's no cluster of neurons. Neurons receive sensory information and directly control muscles, just like our peripheral nervous system. These early nervous systems began to have bilateral symmetry, so one side of the animal would mirror the other side. We also have bilateral symmetry, and they began to be segmented like worms. So each segment of the worm would have a system that had sensors and controlled the muscles of that segment. Just like in our vertebrae down our middle of our body have these repeated segments, which we've evolved from those simple animals. Over time, ganglia of neurons, or clusters of neurons, began to assemble in our primitive ancestors, and they function together in a group to do some sort of computation. And it's these ganglia that we can begin to call something like a brain. So we call this encephalization, becoming more head-like. The spinal cord evolved from these segmented bodies to as a pathway to connect the brain and the sensory and muscles in the body. And finally, these ganglia developed and evolved into physically large brains. So chordates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and us mammals all have a large degree of encephalization and have true brains up in our heads. So we all have heads and brains. Humans have the largest relative brain to body size. And all of these different animals have different specializations in their behavior, and they also have corresponding specializations in their brains. So you can see here this development from simple nerve nets to bilateral symmetric and segmented animals and with nervous systems, to some ganglia in the squid that seem to do some computations, and up to these encephalized chordates, which involve a physical brain and a spinal cord connecting it to the body. But all these chordates have bilateral symmetry and segmented brains and nervous systems. They have a brain and spinal cord that are encased in a hard substance like cartilage or bone to protect them. And they also have crossed organization so that each hemisphere of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. From us all the way down to worms, this is common. And many people ask why this is, and it's not entirely clear why this crossing over exists in our animal kingdom. Okay, and so as these animals have evolved more and more complex bodies and limbs and interactions with the environment, the size of their brains relative to their body has also increased. As their behavior becomes more complex, the requirements of their nervous system also follow along. And so in birds and humans and other mammals, we have very complex sets of behaviors that are learned, and we have corresponding massive increases in our cerebrum, this forebrain structure that allows us to combine these behaviors together in complex ways. So these systems are quite small in fish and amphibians and reptiles, and they become more prominent in birds and mammals. And in large mammals, we have these structures get so big that they have to start getting folded together like a piece of paper in an envelope. And that creates this great amount of surface area that's shoved into this tiny space that allows larger and larger brains in the same cavity. So let's think about how humans' brains and behavior evolved in this situation. Humans are primates, and so we're a member of the order primate. And what we share in common with the other primates is we all have excellent color vision. We have eyes in the front of our face that help us to see depth. One of the most distant relative primates of us is the lemur. So you can think of these tiny little lemurs in Madagascar that have these same features. Female lemurs usually only have one infant that requires a large amount of care for a couple of years. And the large brains of primates allow for very skilled movements and also for social behaviors in packs and cities and towns and groups and clubs. Okay, so the primate order consists of, I was thinking of these tarsiers actually. They're the cute little eyes that stick to the trees. Right, so we're related most closely to all of these different primates. We're of this group, we're called great apes, which we share with chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans and gibbons. And all together, we have large brain to body ratios. Our closest living relative is the chimpanzee. We shared a common ancestor about 5 million years ago. And we evolved from group and share common ancestors with a large group of other hominids, upright walking primates that evolved over the last 5 million years that all walk upright, many of which have gone extinct. So our most distant ancestor that looks like us and walks upright is called Australopithecus, that lived about 3 million years ago. And these animals were early hominids, about a meter tall, and they were upright walking and used tools. And however, their brain and head size was much more similar to that of a modern chimpanzee, and about a third the size of ours. You can read about this history of all the different ancestors they've discovered. Here's kind of the timeline on the right here. So you can see us, Homo sapiens, coexisted with Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals. We evolved from this Homo erectus and Homo habilis. We have this distant Australopithecus ancestors. Okay, and so as these animals evolved, they got larger brains and larger heads and more sophisticated tool use. Around 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens skulls are discovered. So these are people of the same species as you and I. And up until about 30,000 years ago in Europe, they coexisted with Neanderthals. And 18,000 years ago in Asia, they coexisted with tiny little Homo florensis, about 3 feet tall little primates that were upright walking. And Neanderthals had even comparably larger brain sizes. And the reason why we took over from the Neanderthal is largely unknown, but we shared a lot of the same gene pool as the Neanderthal became extinct. So modern humans may have been better tool makers or speakers or had better social organization, but there was certainly a great deal of interbreeding. And some of the genes that we have in our gene pool now, like our ability to absorb vitamin D or fighting off novel diseases and adaptations for cold weather, may have been inherited from interactions with this other species. So scientists have tried to understand humans' unique role in the animal kingdom by thinking about how our brain size is particularly unique. And one way you can think about this is the ratio of the brain size to the body size. So we have clearly other animals with much bigger brains, but they have also gigantic bodies. But if you look at the ratio to brain to body size, you can understand how big an animal's brain is compared to their body. And what we see is humans have the largest brain compared to body size of any other animal in the animal kingdom or that have ever existed. Australopithecus is quite close, and so is a dolphin. Close being that has a much larger brain compared to what would be predicted from the size of our body. So one of the traits that make us unique is that we're big-brained monkeys. Okay, so you can see a dolphin has quite a large encephalization quotient, and so does us and our ancestors. Another thing you can think about is you can count the brain cells themselves, because in that same space, they may be very densely packed or they may be very loosely packed. And here's a good example that a roundworm, 30% of its cells are its brain, whereas a blue whale, less than 0.01% of its cells are a brain. But that doesn't make the worm smarter. A blue whale has many more complex behaviors than the worm. So it's not necessarily just about the ratio of the neurons to the brain size. Right, so two similar brains one could be very densely packed, one could be loosely packed. And so different species have different packing density. So primates have smaller and densely packed cells. And if you count brain cells, humans had about 86 billion neurons, whereas dolphins have 30 billion neurons, more similar to the numbers that a chimpanzee has. The dolphin has a larger brain space, so its neurons aren't quite as packed in. Okay, so we can either consider the size of the brain or the density of the brain. We consider differences between species throughout evolution. Another thing that occurs as these brains grow throughout evolution and throughout our own growth as individuals is that the connections between the various neurons change in their network style. So when brains become larger and larger, the connections between them don't just scale along with them, but they get unique groupings. So for instance, just a small amount of neurons can be kind of scattered together like the ingredients of a cookie. But as the brain gets bigger and bigger, the neurons might form into ganglia or clusters. And these clusters would try to minimize the distance between neurons to minimize the amount of material needed to make the connections. So we'll kind of group together into these clusters. You can think about this from a connection or a network perspective, how this would lead from like a very distributed network where every neuron talked to every other neuron to these more complex networks where there's little hubs of information and small highways to connect between hubs. We'll talk throughout the course about these kind of connections between neurons and how the style of connection can change in different situations. Okay, so the relative size of our brain has increased about 3 times since our Australopithecus ancestors. And what might have led to this, what evolutionary pressures were leading to this growth? One might have been the need to find fruit, but also the increased nutrients we were getting from fruit. So fruit eaters like us primates might have already started to have larger brains. And then you can see even within primates, the primates that eat more fruit in their diet have much larger brain to body ratios. So this spider monkey eats much more fruit and has a much larger brain compared to its body size. Another thing that might have drastically increased the ability of our brain to grow is our cooking. So as our diet became more varied, our brains could grow and we had more time for foraging different foods. And then once we discovered how to use fire, we could metabolize the food with the fire and increase the efficiency of our eating, allowing our brains to grow as well. So many of these things might have been kind of circular, right? And so our physiology may have changed in step with these other changes. So we could have had changes that led to smaller facial muscles here compared to the giant muscles of our primate ancestors. And this less amount of material needed to make these muscles could be used for other things like brain growth. Furthermore, there's been shown that there's different circulation in the brain, so this might have allowed for different amounts of cooling of a larger brain. It's also been proposed that we might be maturing at a different rate. So there's an idea called neoteny, that the childlike features of a species can come to be expressed later and later in the lifetime of the members of that species. And so, for instance, we might all have traits and physical and behavioral traits that baby chimpanzees have, and the human life is actually just kind of extended chimpanzee childhood, where we continue to be excited and like novelty and have this kind of appearance. Okay. Finally, there's some indication that we have some genetic changes. So there might have been some genes that were picked up around the time of Homo habilis that led to increased size of brains. As we start to sequence the genomes of us and our ancestors from the tissue, we can understand these changes better. The last couple ideas about modern human brain size and intelligence is that just because we can use these changes in the physical aspects of the brain to understand changes between species, we need to be very careful when we make these same comparisons within a species. So just because, so for instance, just because someone has a larger brain, one human has a larger brain than another human, doesn't necessarily mean that they're more intelligent, even given what we've just said about humans compared to other animals' brain size. Why? Well, the question is, are people with larger brains more intelligent? And you can see this is a very difficult question to ask and answer now, given what we know about the brain. We would need to control, like, how do you measure the size of the brain? Is it the weight or the volume? Does it depend on the weight of the body? It changes as we age and with our health and with brain damage. And then also, how does one measure intelligence? What do we mean when we say intelligence? Which type of intelligence specifically are we talking about? And so this question is much more complicated. And just because a human, any given human might have a difference in their physical brain, might not necessarily mean that they have a corresponding difference in their behavior. Differences within a species are more complicated than just our study of differences between species. Okay, and with that, that's everything. I'll see you again in the next chapter when we begin to talk about the anatomy of the nervous system. Have a good weekend.